Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. All right, it's 4 p.m. Well, hello and welcome to the Educating Character Initiative's last book club gathering of this academic year. We are really excited and grateful to have a chance to talk with our book author, Benjamin Miller. I'll introduce him more fully momentarily. Also, thank you for being here in April at the end of an afternoon on a Monday. We are really grateful for your company, and we know this time of year is busy. As folks trickle in, I want to share 3 ways you can engage the ECI community beyond this event. The first, and perhaps most obvious, is to join the ECI community. There is a link in the chat to do that now. We will not bombard your inboxes, but we do send an email newsletter once a month that includes information about grants, workshops, upcoming events, and so forth. Second, we hope you'll join us for upcoming online events. We have 2 more webinars this year. A place to register for those is now in the chat. And last but not least, we have a link about ECI's upcoming in-person events. There's a little bit of information about a summer workshop. We're past the registration date for that, but there's also information about our December conference, which we hope to see many of you all at. So a few words on how to participate this afternoon. You do not need to have read any part of the book to participate in the book discussion. We are grateful for your thoughts, and for new ears. And the intention of the conversation that Ben Miller and I are about to have is to give you an introduction to the key ideas of the book so that you can participate even if you haven't had a chance to glance at the book itself, because the topics are really important. I'll open the floor for discussion at around 4:30, 4:35, but feel free at any point to put a question in the chat. If I can weave it in, I will, and if I can't, we can come back to it during the Q&A. Okay, now let me introduce our author, Benjamin Miller. Ben is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His work asks a simple but difficult question. What does it actually mean to be a good democratic citizen? He approaches this question by bringing together political philosophy, empirical political science, and education theory, and by trying to connect abstract democratic ideals to how citizens actually think and act. His book, which we'll be discussing today, draws on philosophy and education theory to work out which educational goals are compatible and incompatible with democratic ideals. His other research focuses more directly on political science, where he collaborates with empirical scholars to make their normative assumptions more explicit, especially assumptions about the meaning of democracy and what it means to be a good voter. The aim of this work is to improve how we study citizens' capabilities and responsibilities and to better assess whether democratic systems are functioning as they should. So I want to start just by saying how much I appreciated this book and how important I think it is for all character educators, because it highlights the fact that it is very easy as a character educator to slip into a liberal practice on accident. And your argument is really nuanced. So what I'm going to try to do is draw out the concrete implications of that argument. And I want to begin with a very, very basic question. What is liberalism?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So liberalism, can mean a lot of different things, and it's a well-traveled idea. So it means a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. But I want to stay at the most basic kind of conceptual level, like what is liberalism as a concept, instead of going in all the filtered down ways that we can disagree about what liberalism means. So in my view, the core idea behind liberalism is that people in a society are supposed to be able to pursue their own ideas of what matters to them, and they're supposed to have their own values, and no one's supposed to kind of stomp on their way of thinking about the world and prevent them from trying to pursue that as long as it's not getting in other people's ways. And so liberalism is this kind of core idea that people are supposed to make their own choices about what matters to them and how to pursue their life. And I think from that idea, that's where we get the idea of constitutional democracies, the idea of having a list of or Bill of Rights. These rights that we have are supposed to be serving this core idea that people are supposed to make their own choice, and the government's not really supposed to be taking a stand on how which view of the good life is better and worse. The government will inevitably coerce us to do certain things, but they're not going to try to say this way of living over here is better than this way of living over here, and we're going to make it easier or harder for one group or another to live well. I think
Thank you.
that's the core idea of liberalism that I want to start with in the book and use in the book.
Thank you. Now that we've got that clarified, which forms of character education are you worried about being illiberal?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot. So I think any character education that has a certain kind of purpose to it, certain kind of aim or goal. And so, the content of the character education can be similar or different, even if the goal is similar or different as well. So you could have two character education systems that look similar in practice, but their goals are quite different. So I'm worried about the goals and what those goals mean. And the goals that I'm worried about are when the character education says we're trying to make sure that you have a certain picture of what it means to live a good life, or that you can't get this character trait unless you adopt this particular worldview.
Mm. Could you play out what role flourishing has?
Yeah, I think that most of the views on offer, as a matter of fact, not necessarily theoretically required, but as a matter of fact, I think most character education scholars are interested in the idea of grounding their character education system in this idea of human flourishing, and not just what way you might view the world and its value, but what way you might understand the value to a human being or to yourself, like what would make you flourish. And then a lot of the character education programs are about here are the character education traits, the character traits you need to be a person who has a good life or a flourishing life. So I'm worried about those types of systems. And if those purposes aren't there, if it's a different purpose, then we'd have to talk about those and whether or not I'm worried about those too, depending on the structure. But it's really the purpose that I'm worried about, not the actual content of the program.
And are there particular settings where you are worried about character education programs that pursue this goal of promoting, of justifying their learning outcomes in terms of personal flourishing?
Yeah, I mean, the major one I'm concerned with is anything that's endorsed or not, or gets funding from the government. But I'm not, I
And
it
for children, yeah?
yes, mostly for children. And I mean, most character education is starts with children. It's not obvious that we can really do good character education with adults. Their character's already in some sense formed. At that point, they can educate themselves maybe or shift a little bit, but that's a different kind of case. And I think again, there aren't that many contexts in which we're educating people with the intent of educating their character. That's not early intervention school type systems. A parent might have a view about what kind of character to educate their children with. I'd say that's a different context, and I'm not as concerned with thinking about that context in the book. I'm more concerned with systematic educational structures.
For children, and especially by the state.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, which forms of character education do you wish character educators or just educators in K through 12 public schools would embrace more consistently or more frequently?
I think I wish they would stop talking about flourishing and talk instead about purposes that might support liberal democracy or civic purposes. So kind of what's the way we make someone a good citizen, given what we know about what we want in a democracy or what we want in a liberal society. So if we have a government that's dedicated to liberal democracy, then we want citizens to function as a part of that system, clearly. And so what kind of traits do they need, if any, to play that role as a group and as individuals. And so that's what I want them. And there are plenty of people who think about this, but
Yeah.
it's not
And I
always
know
good.
we'll know that I know we'll get to this more later, but I want to make it as concrete as possible. Can you give us an example of somebody who has that kind of educational agenda and what kind of, so they would have, I suppose, a vision of how democracy should work, and then also a vision of what a good citizen uh, lit is and what kind of dispositions they have. Can you like that out? Like what an example of that might look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I can give you an example, but it won't necessarily map onto any particular view you see out there in the literature very easily. So there's philosophers and political theorists and education theorists who have this view, and they adopt this idea of civic purposes, and they have some sketched out ideas of traits. If you went back with like Amy Gutman's classic work in the 80s, um, then the idea is we have to educate people to have certain kinds of anti-discriminatory values, and she sometimes calls those virtues. Whether or not they're character is an interesting question. Um, you can look at lots of policy reports, recent and old, that say we have to make people into better citizens, and that's the purpose of education. And they list lots of traits, whether or not some of them are skills, some of them are pieces of information, some of them could be character traits. Most of that work is either really abstract, like the Gutman work, or it's very policy oriented and tries to list things. And neither work kind of does both here's what democracy is and what it requires, and here's what citizens are supposed to do. Instead, they just kind of either talk at the abstract level about good citizenship, or they talk at the very concrete level about here's the list, and they're kind of not clear on whether they're building a story together or they're totally incompatible with each other. That's kind of hard. I guess I would say that what we want is to have a prior understanding of what the values of a liberal democracy are at its most general. And then to, from that, think about what are citizens supposed to do in the system and derive like a list of things they're supposed to do, like actions, like voting is a type of action, but what does it mean to vote well? What does it mean to go to a political protest well? What does it mean to write your representative in a good way? I mean, these are all tasks that you could do. And then what I would want is to say, are there any character traits that make it easier or that you cannot do those actions without? That's the kind of story I'd want. And my view is there's nothing like that fully developed in the literatures.
So in some ways, what your book is, at least implicitly, but maybe explicitly, a call for people to develop models of civic education that are more robust in terms of their democratic philosophy and also their character agenda.
Yeah, I think you could, at the very end, I gesture at this in the last chapter, but I think you could take the lessons of the book as for people who are really more steeped in Aristotelian kind of structures, which are more robust. I would like them to drop the flourishing and the Aristotle bit and adopt and keep the robust part and move it over to civic purposes. And then for people who are doing civic purposes, to recognize that their framework for character is pretty thin and try to like look at Aristotle, Aristotelians for thicker inspirations, but don't bring over the purposes or the structure of the theory.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, in case this isn't already clear, what is the most important difference between Aristotelian character education and more civically oriented forms of character education?
Yeah, I'd say two things maybe. So the first is what I've been saying so far, which is that on the Aristotelian view, the purpose is to make people into better human beings or to make them have a better life for themselves as individuals. Um, the civic purpose is not to make people have better lives. It's to serve the social goals of society, whether or not those social goals are good for the individual. And the state isn't supposed to be really grappling too hard with whether it's good for them or not, because it's not supposed to be making assumptions about what is good for them or not. Instead, it's just saying, we need you to do this. And then because we need you to do this, we're gonna educate you to do that, whether you like it or not, basically. That's the big purpose. The big difference is that purpose, that orientation. I'd say the second difference is a structural one because of that purpose difference. For civic education, the structure or the logic goes democratic goals, derive what citizens are supposed to do in a democracy as part of those to satisfy those goals, derive from that skills, knowledge, and traits you need to do those tasks which serve those goals. The Aristotelian structure, and I think this is true of some non-Aristotelian views too, is to really not kind of derive the virtues from the idea of flourishing, but to say that the idea of the virtues and flourishing are kind of one. They're kind of constitutive, right? So what does it mean for a neo-Aristotelian ethicist? What does it mean to live a good life? It's to live a life of these virtues. So the idea that there's kind of like a distinct idea of flourishing separate from the virtues is not how the Aristotelian structure works. It's a much more kind of constitutive. argument than it is a kind of a derived one after another
So
strategy.
you could have an educator who says it's really important for us to develop oh the virtue of respect because it's essential for to motivate people to practice democratic deliberation in a way that is
Mhm.
constructive. And you can have an Aristotelian say it's essential that they develop respect because they're flourishing, their ability to live a good life is bound up in their ability to practice respect. But those would be two really different reasons to teach someone to practice respect.
Yeah, and I'd also say that it's very unlikely that giving different reasons for a trait will lead you to the exact same trait. And
Hmm.
so you might say that plausibly respect is something that come out of both views, but what respect looks like on democratic purposes is going to be quite different probably than respect on non-democratic purposes or Aristotelian purposes. And so, I mean, this is a thing that I have a worry that I have about a lot of the character education work is that people claim that they're talking about the same trait, but if you fill it out, are they really? So this is a lot of the psychological literature that people like to cite, like the old Seligman stuff let's say, oh, there's these universal virtues. Well, at the level of names, right? Courage
Hmm.
is a virtue across lots of cultural groups. Do they mean the same thing by courage? That's a different question. And I think what you'll find is the purpose will infuse the actual content of the character.
Yeah. Could you play that out? Like how would respect as a civic virtue versus respect as an Aristotelian virtue? Would that how would those look and feel different? I don't even
Yeah,
know
I
if
mean,
respect is an
yeah,
Aristotelian.
respect is
I don't
hard
even
on
know if
res
that
I'm not
makes
sure
sense.
it is either. So
Yeah.
maybe let's just talk about respect on democratic kind of view.
Yeah.
You might say something, you don't have to say this, but you could say something like, um, what respect is in kind of democracy is outward behavior focused. It's focused on like how you act towards other people who disagree with you or are different from you in political contexts. But you don't have to necessarily internally regard them a certain way. And so maybe you could separate those two things. And so in that sense, it's not clear respect is even a character trait rather than a way of acting outwardly. And so it really depends on your account on what you mean by these things. I do think it's plausible to think from democratic purposes we could get some character traits, but exactly what they are and what they look like, the proof is going to be in the pudding of what exactly is the purpose and the thing that the citizen is supposed to do before we can really know, is this respect like that respect?
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a very small side note, but I think I think for democracy to run, you've got to have a bunch of motivational engagement from citizens. Like they have to be sort of affectively interested in showing each other respect too, which moves it closer to a virtue. But
Yeah.
that's a different rabbit hole.
Yeah,
Okay,
so that example I used, I didn't mean to say that's my view. I actually think it needs to be more effective in the mind of the person and color their belief structures, but you could have a view that doesn't require all that stuff.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. We're getting so many good questions in the chat, but I
Sure,
do
and I
want
can't
to do
multitask, so you're going to have to
no,
tell
me
me to look at them.
neither. Me neither. I'm listening, but I do want to do this thought experiment question because I think one of the things I most enjoyed about your book is that it made clear just how specific, how particularistic and rich, but also weird Aristotle's account of human flourishing is, and that there's when you use terms like flourishing and virtues, it sounds like, oh yeah, everybody could endorse that. And then you get into the specifics of what Aristotle thinks, and you're like, everybody could not endorse that. In fact, I
Yeah.
could not endorse that. So I want to do just to name three different worldviews and get your thoughts on how
Yeah.
compatible these worldviews would be with an Aristotelian worldview of what it means to live a good life. So we'll play with that a little.
Okay.
Okay, example A. So, a Christian worldview that says the best way to live is to love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, perhaps even making difficult material and emotional sacrifices to express that love. How compatible is that vision of a good way of life with Aristotle's vision of a good way of life?
I think not at all.
Say
Um,
more.
Yeah, I mean, we could get into the kind of metaphysics of what Aristotle thinks God is, which would be really weird
Weird,
itself. But even without that,
really weird.
Aristotle's view is, I think, very straightforward. The content of the good life is the best thing in the world is behaving virtuously. And that's not about purposes outside like God or things like that. It's being a good person is the purpose of human life. It's the thing that makes a good human life good and good for that person. And so adding on this extra stuff about communion with God is really an extra add-on and
Or
not
love.
part.
It doesn't seem
Or
like love is a central concern of
I think
Aristotle's.
not. No.
So if your central concern is love, a good Aristotelian, you probably are not.
Yeah, unless you want to kind of make love subordinate to the virtues in some way, which I don't think would be very plausible.
Thank you. Okay, example B. Let's say that you have grown up in a family system where family is the most important thing. You want to live, your family has taught you that living in intergenerational households where the young and the old build close ties to each other, people are taken care of as they age, uh, aunts and uncles and cousins participate in child rearing, that maintaining that kind of unit is the most important thing to living a good life. And you make career choices and geographic residence choices, even make perhaps voting choices on the basis of protecting your family and your family's ability to live in this way. Is this compatible with being an Aristotelian?
No. Because again, like the most important thing is being virtuous and caring. And so the thing you ought to value the most it is acting on the virtues, acting in accordance with the virtues, having the virtues. And so family can be very important, but it can't be the most important thing. And I say that it's important to note when we say the most important thing, it's really easy in contemporary language to think what that means is that's what you're always thinking about or that's what you're aiming at. Aristotle has a pretty subtle view here. His view is that you can list what the things are that are most important or most constitutive of a good human life. That doesn't mean you're supposed to be motivated as if the top level things are the only ones you pursue and the lower level things don't matter to you or they matter to you in the same way that your charger matters to your for your phone or things like that. So he doesn't have a very clear modern idea about the way that the structure of the value translates down to the motivations of the agent. And so you could be a really good Christian in some sense on the Aristotelian view, but you can't think it's the most important thing. And same thing with the familiar view. You can value your family quite a lot, but you can't think it's the most important thing.
That I think is the orientation. Like, what's at the top of the value chain? It
Yeah,
seems
I want to this first comment you made about the weirdness of Aristotle's theory. I agree with you completely, and I tried to keep some of the weirdness out of the book because I don't want I think it's not true that the weirdness is what makes Aristotle's theory problematic, because a lot of the weirdness can be jettisoned, and that's the Neo-Aristotelian, right? So, like, I totally buy that by adding the Neo label, you can get rid of some of Aristotle's weirder and uncomfortable views. My view is that the depth of the structure of the account is something you can't get away from if you make any claims about what matters as a flourishing life. And so the idea that you can have a less weird view of flourishing, that's true, but you'll still have a very deep structural idea of flourishing, and that will be incompatible with very common understandings of how to live that actually exist in our society today. And those people will naturally want to say, well, I don't buy that Aristotle stuff or that Aristotelian type stuff. That sounds plausible, but it's not my view, right? It's totally fine for the Christian to say, I don't buy your view about what's good for human beings once that view is fleshed out. I think one of the traps we get into in talking about flourishing is we don't fill in the details about what it means to flourish. And my challenge in the book, I guess, generically is something like fill in the details, and I bet I can find a totally reasonable way of living in the US today or some other place that will be incompatible with that. And so then that's the problem with having a flourishing view, is that you can't easily just educate everybody for that and that be uncontroversial.
we're getting so many good questions in the chat. Before I turn it over to I, before I turn it over to the crowd, I kind of want to get your thoughts. What have we not covered that you think is really important?
I think the one thing I'd add is kind of my penultimate chapter, or chapter 8, is really about like it's focused on what's really attractive about the Aristotelian view or the Neo-Aristotelian view. And basically, my argument in the book is supposed to be in the form of a dilemma, right? It's like there's these attractive elements of Aristotle's view that people like. They like the idea of a robust theory of virtue. They like the idea of flourishing. They like the idea of practical wisdom. My view is once you understand those things very well, they run up against basic liberal principles. And so you can it's a dilemma. You can give up liberal principles and take these positive things, but you're really giving up something pretty big. And the challenge is you liked these things about Aristotle, but if you want to keep being a liberal, it's not clear you can have them. And so that one chapter in the book is about why practical wisdom goes hand in glove with a particular view of flourishing. You don't have to have the Aristotelian view of flourishing, but you have to have a filled-in conception of flourishing. And if you have that view, then and you want to educate practical wisdom in schools for children, then you're going to have to be pretty non-diverse in your teaching because you're going to push one line of what a good life is, and some people are not going to be able to be on board. And so
Yeah.
practical wisdom to me is a thing you lose if you want to be committed to liberalism. And that's most people think of practical wisdom as Aristotle's big contribution that separates him from Plato or people like that. And I think that's right. And so to me, you give up practical wisdom, you're not really an Aristotelian anymore.
Mhm. Okay, you said something interesting earlier. Well, I have an interesting question about if you can't do character education as it's unethical to do character education for children or Aristotelian character education for children, which I think you take to be the case. And at least it's at least not legitimate from a liberal perspective. Um, then and it's difficult to do character education of adults. Then like where that might be possible.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I guess I didn't say this earlier. I should have probably. I am really pretty strongly committed to being an Aristotelian in ethics.
yeah. Yeah.
So this is an internal critique. I'm not an anti-Aristotle person. I love Aristotle. I love Neo-Aristotelianism. I just think we can't adopt it in a liberal society. And I don't think we should give it up. Some people think we should give up liberalism to save Aristotle. And I think that's absolutely not the way to go because then we lose all the list of rights that we all like. I mean, basically, the reason for a Bill of Rights is liberalism. So I don't want to lose that stuff. So I think this is a problem that I kind of only vaguely explore at the end of the book. Can Aristotelianism, ethically speaking, really survive at the highest level? And if there's no location for you to systematically educate people to be Aristotelians? And I think that just means Aristotelianism can only survive in a kind of haphazardish way adopted by adults like me, say, at a later stage in their life, and then they can't really have a clear pathway to being fully virtuous in the way that Aristotle understood it. That
So you
doesn't
have
mean you
a tragic
reject it.
worldview.
Yeah. It's an unfortunate thing, but I think this is what liberalism demands of us. It demands of us that if we all want to get along in some sense, we have to recognize that some ways of living are going to be unfortunately crowded out because they're not really compatible with the liberal framework itself, which allows us all to have our choices about how to live.
That was beautifully said. I want to turn, there's so many good questions in the chat, but in order to give me a moment to process those questions, I'm going to ask that our first question be a verbal one from our audience. So if our audience could raise your hands if you're willing to speak. If you've already shared a question in the chat and you're willing to verbalize it, I'm happy to call on you. But we'll start with a verbal question. And Howard has a verbal question. And I will ask folks to make sure that their questions are in fact questions and can be articulated in 1 minute or less. Okay, Howard, go for it.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for the book. Why are you focusing on eudaimonia so much? Why not just talk about virtues, however they're grounded? That is, wouldn't any character education that pushed controversial virtues be incompatible with political liberalism?
Hi, Howard. Nice to see you. Um, Well, because I don't like well, like is maybe the wrong word. I don't think it's correct to just introduce virtues without saying something about why you think they're virtues. So I think in a liberal society, we're owed justifications about how we're being educated or why we're being educated with this or that, or why this policy exists or why that policy exists. We're owed justifications. And so we can't just throw in, here's an idea, let's test it. That's not good enough. We have to say, why is this the idea that you want to push in the education system? And so I don't think we can get away with not giving the answer to the why. I hope that is
Well,
understanding your question.
let's
Right.
put it a little differently. No matter how they're grounded, wouldn't any controversial list of virtues be problematic?
Yes. Yeah, we can talk about the virtues on their own, just say, but I think the controversy is going to come from why do we need these? What do they do for us? And so we're going to get back to the purposes to determine that they're controversial.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to now point our attention to a question from Betsy Berry, which I think echoes a similar sentiment as David Cunningham's question. Betsy, would you
Do
like
you
me
want me
to
to?
read it? Yeah, that'd be great. If you could
Yeah,
speak.
I'm happy to do that. So thank you, Ben. I really appreciate this. I direct our teaching center here at Wake Forest, and I'm also a political liberal, so I'm very interested in this book. Um, I think your excellent argument also turns, though, on a particular view of education. And so, as the teaching center director, I was thinking of that. So, yes, there are different purposes we can have for education, and I appreciate you saying more about that because I haven't read the whole book, and so I'm looking forward to thinking about that issue. But there are also particulars in how we teach that seem to make a difference. And I agree actually with David that like we'll never be like fully non-influential when we're teaching. Like teaching is about influence, but there are degrees of coercion, I think, involved in how we teach. And so I'm wondering if that makes a difference for you, Ben. So if you're thinking about some types of pedagogy that allows students to like learn about Aristotle, but we're not saying this is the truth. And maybe that wouldn't be Aristotelian character education for you.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And the book doesn't really, to disappoint you, but the book won't have a lot about the how because
That's
I
okay.
think that's really essential, but the book just can't take that on. Um, I think you're absolutely right that the how matters and the purpose matters too. Um, I guess my view is, and you don't have to be an Aristotelian to have this view. You could have a robust idea of character education without being an Aristotelian. But the Aristotelian character education program, whether it's Neo or Aristotle's own, is this idea that educating character is a really integrated, holistic type of thing. And so the idea that you could teach about Aristotle and actually be teaching people character is not right. So the idea is if you want to teach people to have character, you have to teach them how to practice things, you have to teach them ways of observing the world so that their perception changes when they look out at a situation. This requires all sorts of inputs, not just reading a text. Um, some people in Aristotle scholarship like to think that Aristotle has a more texty based view of how you educate people, but I think we can, whether we agree with that or not, we can just have our own psychology of education separate from him and say character education is a really robust, integrated type thing that comes at multiple levels from all directions for a long period of time. And so I would say, yeah, we can teach about Aristotle. We can teach that this is one way of living a good life. This is another way of living a good life. We're not endorsing these. That's fine. I'm not clear at all that that could be counted as character education.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Like, so I think I agree with that it's not just thought-based, but you can imagine a world where you have your students do projects related to perceptions and case studies, et cetera, but then they're just applying their own theories of virtue, right? Like, so they're different, but they're still thinking about perceptual. It's still holistic, but kind of chaotic, a little more chaotic. And that's what we're trying to do, I think, and that's why it's hard for us to do what we're doing.
Mhm.
But still, it wouldn't be good Aristotelian character education, as I take what you're saying. Like, it would
I
still
mean,
be too chaotic.
yeah, I mean, abstracting away from the Aristotelian bit a little bit, I think if you want to educate someone with a kind of a deep character trait, giving them a lot of options at the value level will not do it, right? So like you have to organically integrate how you perceive the world. And how you perceive the world is about values. It's about this thing matters more than that thing in this situation. I don't see how you can do that by letting people have their own plug and play background ideas. how can you teach someone to perceive this situation this way if you don't know what they care about? That's hard to, I don't see how you, I could be wrong psychologically because I'm not an educational psychologist or a perception scholar. But to me, Aristotle's insight is right. Your values influence how you perceive the world, and your value training will impact how you see it. And so if we don't do the value training part, we won't get the trait.
I think it also matters the age that we're talking about, because I think it's hard to imagine for K through 12 um, training for values in a way that is attempting to be thoroughgoingly persuasive rather than coercive. But I think you can start to imagine training for values at the level of the profession or the maybe a little bit in undergrad where you really are trying to offer a perspective and inviting on value and inviting adults to see if it's interesting to them, see if they find it palpable, see if they find it persuasive. Like, I do think that values education, the older people get, the more you can really ascertain to persuade somebody of something without paternalism. And so I think that changes things. If I may jump in here.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I should also add, Liz and I talked about this before. I'm not against paternalism per se, and I'm not against coercion per se. I'm just against it if it's run by the state or kind of allowed by the state in educational contexts, paternalism at least. But I'm all for coercion, coerce people to develop the traits that will make liberal society continue. Yeah, if they don't like it, too bad in some sense. Like, we have to preserve the liberal structure and the citizens' way of doing things. And so coercion and paternalism by themselves aren't necessarily fully problematic.
Which is a hard thing to say in a lot of spaces, but I think is an important thing. I'm going to turn to a question from the chat from Kirby Goff, and then David Cunningham, you're up next. So this is for Kirby. Do you want to give voice to it, or would you like me to read it?
Oh, thank you. It's fine if you read it.
Okay, it's nicely phrased. Oh, so Ben, what do you make of the claim that virtue was essential background to liberalism as put forth by Locke, Mill, and others?
Yeah, I'd say the devil's in the details. What if there are virtues that are required for having a liberal society that works well? What are they and how do we know? My view would be structurally, we know because we have identified what the liberal goals or ends are, or the democratic goals and ends are. And then we think about what behaviors the citizens have to engage in to realize those goals or help realize those goals along with the other branches of government and things like that. And then we ask which or any character traits make it easier or are essential for people to behave in those ways, in the right kind of ways. And if there are such virtues, then we need those. If there aren't, then we don't. And so I'd say about Locke and Mill and others, they do what most of us do, which is reasonable, but not precise enough, it seems to me, for educational policy and things like that, which is they're kind of vague about the connection between these virtues and what they are exactly and what they require psychologically and how they contribute to the purposes of a liberal or democratic society. And so fill in the details on those dimensions, and then we can find out if virtues are really necessary. And until then, I remain agnostic, I guess, on any particular virtue they mention.
Thank you. David? You've got several in the chat, so I won't presume which one is the most interesting one at the moment.
Well, several, right? So in your answer, Ben, to the host's last question, you sort of hit that classic paradox of liberalism, which is that you're liberal about everything except whether you can be a liberal or not. That's not allowed within liberalism, which is exactly the point that I want to ask you about, which is, isn't the view of liberalism that you've got going here just a sort of theoretical kind of, excuse me for saying this, but Platonic construct of it? We don't live in that society where no one ever tells anybody what to do. The absolute freedom from paternalism that you describe here is not something any of us experience, and certainly not in school ever, right? All education, it seems to me, in even the most free society, is always directive. It's always pointing people to certain things as better than other things. And it gets more so as you go up the educational scale. As one person mentioned in the chat, you've got professional schools that are doing things like teaching people empathy. That's very, very descriptive, paternalistic. It's a virtue. You have to have it. We're going to make you have it in order to be a doctor, etc. And you said you're okay with coercion, but I'm not quite sure you are, given what you've said about the kind of liberal society that you imagine you might hope for. So I guess I'm interested in understanding how you kind of get out of that particular paradox.
Sure. I think the first thing to say is this is the challenge of liberalism, right? The challenge of liberalism is how can we all have very, very different views about what matters and why, pursue very different ways of living in a society together and make those rules together. I think that is the challenge of liberalism. Like that is why it's a very difficult thing to realize well, and that you're right about that. I think I take a little issue about what world we live in and what world we should try to realize, and also with the idea of paternalism. So your doctor example, you can teach people empathy without it being paternalistic. Paternalism means I'm teaching you empathy because it'll be good for you. But if we teach doctors empathy, we're teaching doctors empathy because it's good for their patients, not because it's good for them. So that's not paternalistic if that's the goal. And so what my view of liberalism is we want as much as humanly possible to eradicate those paternalistic type structures from the way that we educate, from the way that we make laws and policies. We want the laws and policies to be about making space for you to pursue your own understanding of yourself and your values, while at the same time preserving that for everybody else to the extent that that's possible. To the extent that that's possible is not supposed to be a throwaway. Some things will not be possible, right? Extreme cases would be, you can be a Nazi in society, but you can't really be one who really practices it fully in society. We will have to stop you. And so the idea is that liberalism does start from the premise that, yeah, you have to accept this. But you have to accept this is in some sense thinner than you must endorse this. Instead, it's you must act in accordance with this while you live under these rules. And you must try to make new rules under the spirit of this ideology, whether you buy it or not. So, for instance, Rawls, who's one of the most kind of hands-off type of liberal thinkers in terms of this idea, he wants to really strongly make sense for anti-liberal religious folks like the Amish. He wants those people to have a space in our society. He says, as we want to be able to make as much space for non-liberal thinkers as is possible with actually having stable democratic laws. At some point, if you have too many people who aren't committed to liberalism, the stability of the liberal society will break down. And so there's a question of how much can we tolerate. But if we can tolerate those non-liberal ideologies, we should. That's the challenge, and that's the challenge of liberalism, because that does sound kind of paradoxical.
Right. Well, I'm all in favor of making those spaces for the non-liberal world, right? I mean, I'm a Stanley Hauerwas student kind of at a certain level, so there's that. But I guess I'd quibble a little bit with your notion that paternalism is only paternalism if it's doing it for the sake of you being good. I think a lot of paternalistic language and action actually is to make other people less uncomfortable. It doesn't have anything to do with your character whatsoever. So I don't know if you want to sort of dig down into that. That may not be the right word, but I'll step back. I know a lot of other people want to get a word in.
And I think the next question will go to John Lysaker. If you want to address that one, then that's fine. But also I want to give John a chance to ask a question.
Ben, yeah, I appreciate that you're tackling this challenge and that you're checking your own ethical longings as they run up against political commitments. And I'm wondering your thoughts about private school and whether or not part of your coercion is to outlaw private school. Because I think that over the last 30 years or so, the goal has been that if the school doesn't allow for the more personalized, family-grounded conceptions of the good life to be pursued, people are just going to go off into their own school. And then we'll create weird charter schools, right? So there's been a way in which there's a flight from that. Um, and then there's also the suspicion, which others have mentioned, which is there seems to still be maybe you've outsourced the conception of the good life to liberalism and claimed that it's neutral. But I'm just wondering, like, one of the worries is the actual empirical consequence of this is just the further balkanization of micro communities who actually become illiberal because they never develop the capacities you want, right? Because they just go hang out with their own. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on private school and whether or not you want to mandate that everyone has to go to public school and you can't go hang out and just with people like you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think this is an important question, and it's not really developed in any great detail in the book. I talk about it a little bit, but not a ton. I mean, my default position is, yeah, private schools in the real world are seriously problematic for the kinds of reasons you describe. I can imagine a world where private schools with comprehensive doctrines, or you could have Aristotelian schools or Catholic schools or whatever. I can imagine a world in which that is compatible with liberalism, but I don't think it's very plausible. And I don't think it fits very well with our current world. So my view is in the current world that we have a big problem. Private schools shouldn't really exist in our current economic and social environment because they create these little things, like you say, these enclaves. But the problem isn't that the private schools exist necessarily. The problem is that the quality of the school in terms of the purposes of the education varies from school to school and varies, especially contrasting public versus private schools, right? So if we had a society where the public schools were, without any question, exactly as good as the private schools, and none of the private schools were better in terms of the things that they were giving the students, except in terms of personal preference about worldview, then that's a world in which private schools might be acceptable because all the schools were teaching the same things at the public schools, and there was no performance reason to leave the public school, the public school. Here's the problem with that theoretically. Can a particular private school that has a particular worldview really survive if it's teaching fully and all of the liberal purposes? Right? Can you really teach people to be good democratic citizens who are diverse and plural in their understanding of other people and teach them to be an Aristotelian from the ground up, from like age 3 and up? I'm not sure that's really possible. And so that's where I'd say theoretically the rubber would hit the road. But in our world today, and in any near possible world, I'd say private schools are probably no good.
Gotcha. And just quick, so I understood, and you are requiring a civics curriculum for all private schools.
Well,
I think compatible with democratic values. So
I think the way that I understand the school system, if you understand it in a robust civic way, is we need, but also are owe to citizens that they understand their rights and they understand that we're trying to protect their ability to make choices about the good life. And that requires potentially a lot of robust training, certainly more than we give now, right? Which is just like maybe a civics course at that. Like I didn't even have a civics course in high school, so I didn't get any civic training. But whatever the training is, it's going to be more than we currently do. And it's probably going to last multiple years rather than a couple classes. And it's hard to see. And private schools, as I understand the rationale for allowing them, is as long as they're giving you what's essential, they can go above that.
Yeah.
But if what's essential is much more robust than currently gets taught in schools, then it might be harder for those schools to really teach both types of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Randall Curran, next question to you. I think you're muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Thanks. Hi, Ben. So glad to see your fine book discussed in this forum. I have a question that's at least in the ballpark of one you might have heard me ask before. So, Rawls in Justice is Fairness says that the idea of cooperation includes the idea of each participant's rational advantage or good um, from the standpoint of their own good. And you can't have a theory of justice without a metric of justice. Given what I just read to you about what's included in the concept of cooperation, um, it's pretty obvious you're going to have a metric of justice that's going to be some kind of evidence-based pie that would be fairly divided from the perspective of enabling people to live lives that are good from their own point of view. So why can't we think of education within a Rawlsian liberal democratic perspective in exactly that way? Can we not identify any developmental prerequisites for people to live good lives, whatever their conception of a good life turns out to be? Because we can't assume they have anyone when they're in our hands as minor children. So I know Rawls in 93 began to insist that it could only be for civic purposes, couldn't be anything but civic purposes for which we could educate. But I don't see how this adds up. Do you have any thoughts about that? Wouldn't be an Aristotelian conception of flourishing, obviously.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. Yeah, this is more Rawls exegesis than it is my position necessarily, but I like Rawls, so I think he's right to make the political turn in the 93 book. And I think the answer for him is the primary goods, right? The primary goods are the all-purpose means that citizens need in order to pursue their role as good citizens, but also, as a matter of fact, will probably relate, depends on the person's view, as means to them pursuing their own understanding of the good life as well. So money is a primary good, and so money is going to help them live the kind of life we need them to live democratically, but it's also going to make it easier for them to make choices about their life and the value in their life, things like that. The social bases of self-respect are things you need to be an equal member of society, but they're also the type of psychological thing you need to have the confidence to pursue your own ideas of the good when faced with, I don't know, just not just disagreement, but vehement disagreement and attitudes of rejection. And so having that social basis of self-respect is a really important thing, which will relate to people's development of the good, even though its main purpose is civic. I think you could try to make Rawls more robust. This is the Nussbaum kind of capabilities approach way. I don't think Nussbaum wants this, but I like it that think it this way. Its capabilities is just kind of an addendum to the primary goods that turns out there's not just things like this, but you also add in the capabilities, and those are actually primary goods themselves. So you can get a lot of things on the table in this justificatory way where citizens need these things, and they will help citizens, as a matter of fact, pursue different goals that they have separate from democratic goals. But we wouldn't want to call those a theory of flourishing or parts of a flourishing life. We want to say they may or may not be part of your flourishing life. That's up to you to sort out.
Sure.
But we're not going to say these are good for you. We're going to say these help us make our democracy work.
Yeah.
And if they happen to make it easier for you to pursue your way of life, then that's actually helpful, because one of the things you need to have as a good citizen is your own conception of the good life. As you say, the rational advantage is something you got to have to engage in cooperative activity over disagreement. And so, those are the two moral powers for Rawls, the sense of justice and the conception of the good. We're just not supposed to tell people what the conception of the good is supposed to be.
Yeah.
I'm going to take privilege here as the facilitator, because I do want to make sure we get one more question in before we wrap things up. So Michael Prinzing, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I just wanted to ask about the attractiveness of liberalism. And it seemed to me like I don't know, maybe there's a parallel between the kinds of things you wanted to say about flourishing and Aristotelianism, where, as you're saying, when it's put abstractly, people go, "Oh yeah, great, 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 great." But then you're like, "Okay, but like spell that out. Like, what do you really mean?" And then people go, "Oh, wait a minute, I don't," then the problems arise. But it seemed like, I don't know, maybe there's something similar kind of going on with liberalism. When you put it in this very abstract way, like we just want to make sure that everybody gets to have their own vision of the good life and they can pursue that autonomously. And we just don't want to stomp on anybody's visions of what it is to live well. Um, then everybody's like, yay, great. But then when you go, okay, but here's what that means. There's a lot of coercion and paternalism and, blah, blah, blah. It's incompatible with this. It's incompatible with that. No private schools, or at least maybe under very, very specific conditions. Then I wonder if people start to go, wait a minute, like this was the thing that we thought was so great. I don't know about that anymore. Um, so I'm curious, like, do you encounter that kind of thing, or do you think there's a similar kind of parallel worry to the one that you raised about flourishing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think one part of the answer to that question is yes. Once you fill in the details, you can look less attractive from a perspective. And it is. Some people, there are some Aristotelians like, people like Alistair McIntyre who just want to throw out liberalism, right? This is a way of going. I guess here's the rejoinder that I like, at least. We can't get the Bill of Rights without liberalism. If you like, we can get some of the rights from being committed to democracy and separating that from liberalism. Like we can get freedom of speech just by being committed to democracy. We can't get freedom of religion just by being committed to democracy. So, Josh Ober, one of my advisors, has this book, Demopolis, which is about, he has this view, democracy after liberalism and all of it before liberalism. And he basically says the best equilibrium gain you can get in a society without liberalism, but with democracy, looks better than you thought it does, but it still allows for religious persecution. It still allows for forcing people to adopt a certain worldview against their minority wishes. It allows some members of society to be treated as less worthy than other members of society. Liberalism really is the doctrine that all people are equally worthy and that we ought to design society with that in mind. And I think rejecting liberalism is basically saying we don't have to have the view that all people are equally worthy, that some people their voices might be worth more than others because of their identity or because of their status. And to me, that's the core of liberalism. And so my response to anyone who wants to say, oh, we get all these rules downstream, and I say, well, but if you want your basic right protections like we see in basically every constitution in the world today that's democratic, you got to be committed to liberalism. And the downstream effects are just the effects, and we have to live with them.
That is, I think, a good place to end. I want to thank all of you for being here and point your attention to some links in the chat for how you might engage with ECI further. And I want to say a deep thank you to Ben for insisting that character education pay attention to liberalism and for so thoroughly and articulately explaining the trade-offs that are involved in that. So if you have further questions, we value your feedback, and we hope that the rest of your Monday evening goes really well. Thanks, y'all.
Can I just say thank you to everyone too? Thank you so much for coming in and letting me talk.